Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Hernandez, and our world is currently living in a hopeful doubt that nuclear weapons will never be used in warfare. The last time this happened was in 1945 at the end of World War II, where the US used two bombs against Japan. This marks the only time that these weapons were used in warfare. However, it doesn't mean that these 80 years of nuclear peace have come with challenges. The greatest challenge of this was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which involved Cuba, the United States, and the Soviet Union, which were going through a big phase in the Cold War. Now, not only does this event affect my story, but it affects both of you as being members of the larger Cuban diaspora. At some point, we had family members living on the island that were living through this event. Throughout the speech, I'm going to tell you guys about the history of the island, the events that unfolded throughout the crisis, and a critique from the American part on transparency and using the media for scare tactics. Let's start first with the history. Specifically in 1899, which marked the end of the Spanish-American War and the ceding of Cuba from Spain to the United States as a protectorate. Now, with this label of protectorate, Cuba was being ran domestically and foreignly by the United States with governments that were supposed to be pro-US. Now, according to Louis A. Perez Jr., who published essays on Cuba's history, historiography, and research to the Florida Press University in 1995, this relationship wasn't reciprocal between the US and Cuba and wouldn't be until 1952 when General Fulgencio Batista overthrew the government that was established in Cuba and created a pro-US military dictatorship. This dictatorship would last until 1959 when Fidel Castro led his revolution that would hope to create a fully independent Cuba. But his promises were not met after he established a socialist state in Cuba a few years after that would lead to Cuba under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. According to Robin Blackburn, who wrote the prologue to the Cuban Revolution in 1963 under the New Left Review, this establishment of a socialist stance in Cuba would create the closest socialist state in this time, the only in the Americas, and was just 90 miles away from South Florida. This all culminates to the crisis in 1962. This crisis began with the Soviet Union beginning to build and prepare missiles and missile silos in Cuba as a defense against the American weapons that were in Europe. And according to Graham Allison, who wrote a piece titled The Cuban Missile Crisis, into the textbook Foreign Policy Theories, Actors, and Cases in 2008, although the Cuban crisis technically began October 16th, you could trace American detection as early as October 14th, which was seen through the reporting of American U-2 spy planes flying over the silos in Cuba. Now, there wasn't a lot that happened between the 16th and the 22nd. And on the 22nd, which Myra M. Immel wrote in 2020's The Cuban Missile Crisis, which was published by Greenhaven Press, JFK gave his famous national broadcast to the people, explaining what was going on in Cuba, the establishment of a blockade by the US Navy, and a list of demands to the Soviet Union. Now, after this all happened, eventually the US and the Soviet Union would reach an agreement where the US would secretly remove their weapons from Europe, while the Soviet Union would publicly remove their weapons from Cuba. Now, although this event happened for more than the 13 days, It is said that at the 13th day was when the agreement was made, and the rest of the time was just ensuring that both promises were made. Now, my critique comes from the word secret and in that last line. Throughout this time, the U.S. government was very wishy-washy with how they practiced transparency. If we're taking the original detection of the silos on October 14th, that means that there was 8 days between the discovery and the speech that the U.S. had no idea of what was going on, or at least the U.S. public. And from there to the removal or the agreed removal of the weapons, there were 6 days of the U.S. populace living in angst and anxiety as they were fearing nuclear warfare. And even then, when the agreement was reached, they weren't told of the nuclear weapons that were being removed in Europe, which gave them a false sense of security that the U.S. was strong arming the Soviet Union into removing the Soviet weapons. Now, all of this culminated with the fact that there were media companies releasing videos of the Soviets militarizing the Cuban government, was very angry and very angst to the people. In particular, the Britain Paths directed Cubans prepare for war during the Cuban Missile Crisis circa 1962, which was stored into the WPA film library in 2007, but was shown a very few weeks after the crisis was going down. All these events showed how, although there was some transparency, there was an inconsistency with that transparency, and there should have been either no information leaked or let everybody know what was going on from the beginning. Now, regardless of this, we have lived in a world where luckily both sides managed to agree and were able to discuss their options. If we couldn't have talked through our discussions or agreed onto a specific plan, not only would we not be here, but our grandparents wouldn't be able to live the lives that they did. And it's very important that through the communication that we've had between the Soviet Union and the US, who were mortal enemies, we were able to avoid a nuclear holocaust and ensure that the 80 years of nuclear peace that we have today were secured. These are my citations, and thank you guys for listening.